Okay, let's start the recording. Thank you. So welcome all. Welcome to the third and final module of the Executive Education Programme in Digital Transformation for the Public Sector. I'd like to start with acknowledging the First Nation owners of the lands where we gather today, and we pay respects to the elders and lowers and customs and creation spirits of this country. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching and research and learning and continue to be so, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. I'm going to start with the end in mind. I always put this slide up at the end of our modules. We really value your feedback as part of this programme. So do please be prepared and set a little bit of time aside if you're leaving a bit early or if you're at the end of the programme at 5 o'clock, just to help us out with some feedback and the areas of future interest for you for some deep dives. So this is not the end, but we're looking at the next stage of our engagement. And a couple of links there, which we'll remind you of at the end, to some further ways to engage with the content. So a quick recap, we're on module 3, and module 2 was the what of digital transformation of government, where we discussed those critical components of the trust infrastructure, requisite capabilities, and we had a lively discussion on what's involved to design and increase digital service adoption. We started off with a chat with Randall and looking at the leadership capabilities needed in the digital age. Kevin D'Souza from QUT led us into a discussion around intelligence and spoke of a maturity model for artificial intelligence that he's developed with IBM for the public sector. And Julianne from QUT chaired a panel on trust infrastructure for the 21st century. So we thank all those speakers and the panelists for the time 2 weeks ago. And here we are today. So in a second, Chow Ho from Singapore government, I'll introduce him shortly, will spend some time with us on the topic of anticipating the future and making it happen. And that's in support of our agenda today. So we're looking to discuss the critical ingredients to deliver better, faster, resilient services and policies. And we'll be looking at case studies nationally and internationally, and that highlight the ingredients and the success factors to both accelerate and execute on transformation. And Michael later today will work with us to consider how do we create compelling ambitions so that we change our focus from how do we fix it to how do we get there. After the break, Jane will be chairing a panel on co-design with a sense of ambition, and a lot of case study work through that as well. So a really enlightening session today on how do we do it and what's next. So I'll start by introducing Chow Ho. So Chow Ho is the Government Chief Digital Technology Officer of the Smart Nation and Digital Government Office in Singapore. And he's also currently the Deputy Chief Executive of the Government Technology Agency of Singapore, so multiple roles. In his first role that I mentioned, Chow Ho oversees the development of the government's digital infrastructure and digital technology capability, as well as talent development in the information and communication technology and smart systems. He also oversees the development of platforms to enable resource sharing and interoperability across government, so as to drive the development and delivery of innovative government digital services for citizens and businesses. In the second role, he oversees multidisciplinary teams that develop and manage key government digital products, such as the National Digital Identity, which we're all very interested in. Chow Ho has more than 2 decades of extensive experience, both in public and private sectors, and a strong track record in leading digital transformation. Prior to joining GovTech, he had senior appointments in international banks and consulting companies in the areas of technology, operations, finance, and business. And we are really looking forward to sharing a few moments with you. Thank you, Chow.
Thank you. All right, let me share my slides. Okay, can you see the slides? Should be okay, right? Can see everything? Good. Maybe let me start by a little bit of introduction. I call this presentation writing the inflection point. Mainly because I think one of the things that we all realize about digitalization is never a straight line graph. One of the things which makes it so difficult about digitalization, I can't move my slides. What's happening? Yeah. Okay. It's that, an endeavor like this is actually very, very difficult to achieve, mainly because it requires so many people involved. And, there's so many new change management that needs to be done that it's never a straight line. So what do we mean by inflection point? This is just a very simple chart to show that, we started building engineering capabilities in GovTech as far back as 2014. And during that time, I literally only built one squad of engineers, 7 people. And to show the government that there's a much better way of dealing with technology than just going out there and getting Accenture or one of the system integrators to build something for them. That group of 7 people were not doing big things. We're building a lot of standalone apps, small things. But over time, people, it's like a drug, right? People get used to it and say, wow, there's a much better way of doing things. Why can't we do more of this? And so you'll find that over time, by 16, 17, we were challenged to start integrating a lot of the stuff we built in the front end with the back end. And that's really the difficult part. Why is it difficult? Because all of a sudden, you are not doing modern technology anymore. You also have to bridge modern technology with legacy. And that is really a huge challenge. Then come 2018 and 19, we were pushing the agenda to move to cloud and a full stack. And that was really, really tough. Why? Because as far as governments are concerned, at that time, by 17, 18, everybody talks about cloud, but the reality is that the policy doesn't allow us to use cloud. But we managed to push that through and actually move on to the commercial cloud. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And that was another big achievement that we did. By 2020, I think everybody knew we were all challenged to scale up rapidly to fight the pandemic. And this is one of those very true tests that happens. We went out there claiming that we were agile, we could do things very quickly, we didn't need like 500 people to do it. And all of a sudden, we were called to task. Can you guys actually do it? Can you build me, for example, a contact tracing app in 4 weeks? Can you build a safe entry system in 3 weeks, for example, build a token for me and all that stuff? Because all of a sudden, people were talking about weeks, no more months or years. And that was a real challenge because we claim all these things that we can do, but the reality is that can we actually do it? But we are lucky that we actually did it and did it well. And now we are facing a new normal whereby, the pandemic has redefined the expectations of technology. I don't think we can ever go back to the good old days of let's do a tender for 8 months and get something out in 3 years kind of stuff. So all of a sudden, the challenges have now gathered pace for all of us. But in this whole process, GovTech is now more than 1,000 engineers. And each of the inflection points buys us credibility to build further. So when you look at this chart, you realize that there's a gray line going down, the dotted line. At any one of these points, we could have failed and failed miserably, and people lose trust and then they just go away, right? So there are no guarantees. This is a tough journey, and it's really about navigating a series of pretty difficult inflection points along the way, and they will keep coming at you. Now, one of the most important things we learned is that we need to scale and not just grow. In the beginning, we kept asking for more headcount. Oh, can we have 20 more people for this, 50 more people? And very soon people will look at you and say, hey guys, when are you going to stop growing, right? I mean, I've given you 1,000 people now. Do you need another 5,000? It's not going to happen. There's no budget for it. And then more importantly is that the talent base out there is just not big enough. In Singapore, we're struggling to hire good people, just like Australia. So how do you have accelerators for growth? And 3 things came to us. Number 1 was that by as early back as 2015, we started creating products. Products can scale much better than projects. And maybe one key product we mentioned is National Digital Identity, right? It's a product that's used by the whole of government, plus many other private sector companies in Singapore. Now that product has now grown and grown. We didn't have to keep adding people every time the product grow, because a product can scale very, very efficiently versus just building more projects as you go along. So that's a very important accelerator. The second very important accelerators are platforms. Now, if I'm able to build something that can be reused over and over again, it allows us to scale even faster, right? So instead of building 50 licensing systems, can I build a licensing platform that can onboard 500 licenses? Interesting, right? So how do you think about that? And I'll talk a little bit about that later on too. And then finally, I think one very important accelerator for us is how do you leverage the ecosystem? As part of the cloud journey, I think one of the very important parts of the ecosystem was our ability to leverage SaaS. So for example, if you look at our HR finance system today, we have moved to Workday. And we can scale very quickly because Workday can scale like there's nothing, right? For CRM, etc., we've moved very much to Salesforce. Payments, we've used Stripe, PayPal, etc. So these ecosystem components also help us scale very quickly. This allows us to really make the best use of technology, and more importantly, of the people that we have. And it makes us, really able to scale 10x, 15x, 20x, versus always relying on getting more people to build systems. And I think that's a very important part of that journey that we take. Now, to make all this happen, you need to do 4 things, right? I call it a reduction mindset. Reduction meaning that you need to reduce things. First, reduce complexity. I think one of the biggest challenges government have is we deliberately make things more and more complex as we go along. We add policies over policies, we add more difficult processes, and all of a sudden, when you start pulling agencies together, it's like, wow, it's very complex. And to be able to automate something like that is just impossible, right? So you need to reduce complexity. The second thing you need to reduce is duplication. Like I mentioned before, you need to almost take a platform approach and reduce duplication significantly. You don't need 62 grants platform and another 78 licensing platform. Why can't you have one, right? Reduce duplication, very important. The third thing you need to reduce is tech debt. Why is tech debt a problem? Because government are still laden with legacy systems. And because we are laden with legacy systems, everything you do is 10 times more difficult than when you have, for example, a microservice driven approach or API driven approach. And the last thing you need to reduce is toil. What is toil? I mean, for the technical guys, you probably understand. You need to automate everything. Why does a government data center need 500 people to operate when AWS probably need 10? That's because you automated everything. They have taken the toil out of the system and automate them so that you don't really need more and more people. And this is a very important way of accelerating your growth and development. So what we did was that we built what we call the Singapore Government Tech Stack. In some ways, it's like a government in a box, whereby we are able to abstract components of an application design and make it infinitely reusable. For the base layer, what we did was that we streamlined very much a lot of the development toolkits, the tool chain, the runtime, the communication, on our own API gateway. We actually work with GitLab, for example, to build Ship and Hats, which is really our DevOps platform. And all these things at the end makes development a lot more effective and efficient as you go along. When I say build, I don't really mean build everything ourselves. It's really about leveraging the industry, buying the right components, stitching it together, putting in compliance and security so that it can be used by the government in the most effective way possible. And for the service layer, what we did was that we started building a lot of reusable APIs and microservices. An example was like for example, for authentication and the IAM solution, we use SingPass, for example. We got basically like we use external providers like Stripe and everything for payments. We have a Dicata for IoT stack. We have a Woga platform for central analytics and monitoring. So these things don't have to be rebuilt every time you build an application. They can be reused. And that really is a tremendous accelerator going forward. And, you know, since it's AWS, I need to sell this slide a little bit. We went on the cloud probably like about 3 years ago now, where we managed to break all the myth about cloud being not safe and government should not do it. We went on the commercial cloud, and we are now committed to move 70% of all our government workloads into the commercial cloud, powered by AWS, Azure, and GCP. Today, we are already at 58%. By the end of next year, we should reach the 70% mark. So you would safely say that most of our workloads and platforms are on the commercial cloud. And they give us a significant ability to scale. It allows us to really leverage the entire ecosystem out there. And more important, it allows us to take a very different view of security. Because a lot of people say of this myth that as long as I can touch the firewall, security is there. We took a lot of time to convince people that that's not the case, and that cloud security is as good, or sometimes even better, than on-prem security. I'm going to skip a couple of slides in the interest of time, because I know time is not, you know, I might just cover this slide and I'll go to the last few. The other thing that's quite important is really the whole data conundrum. Your ability to clean the data and achieve a single source of truth is actually very important. It's something that we did probably about 7-8 years ago. And now I think we're lucky in the sense that we're able to share data very, very pervasively across the government and with the industry. We have an API gateway called Apex, where with central discoverability of all the data that we have. And it allows data sharing to be, you know, very, very simple, just by flicking on a switch, rather than in the past, whereby you have to get all kinds of approvals and basically get vendors to help you code some download programs, etc. So this is actually a very important part of digitalization. If your data is not flowing, your data doesn't have high quality, chances are that you can't digitalize. Everything will fall apart, basically. I'm going to skip a couple of slides because there are more details, but to come to this one. You know, at the end, it's really building a solid digital infrastructure. And that consists of, you know, core infra and digital workplace tools, the tech stack I mentioned, commercial cloud, adopting a very different cybersecurity paradigm, very much away from the old style of like, let's build a high wall and parameters, to more and more very much as a least privileged zero trust architecture that will really help us scale better, and really build a data architecture and provide the data engineering needed to allow data to flow very quickly and with high quality across the government, so that, you know, a lot of things can be built without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel. And we are now reaching a point whereby the sensors IoT and the robotics platform is also being standardized, so that we're able to use IoT and robotics in a more what you call scalable way. The reality is that there are literally 1 million sensors out there. How do you onboard them? How do you secure them? How do you make sure that you're able to capture the data and share the data well, again, among all the government departments as well as the private sector? So the IoT platform is just as important as the software platform that we build. And all this kind of come together in what we call a one government approach. Unlike what other people think, the government does have citizens, does have customers. Now, our customers are the citizens that we serve, the businesses that we serve, and also very importantly, are the government employees. Government hire a lot of people. Singapore has 150,000 public sector employees. They are just as important a part of your customer base that we serve. So what's a one government approach? We have come up with a national digital identity, a set of products that represents the IAM for the government as well as for private sector. They allow one-stop identification and authentication. And below that, once you get past that gate, with a single digital ID for the whole government as well as the whole country, you got Live SG, which is really our moments of life application for citizens. we took this approach quite a few years back and told people that, look, government cannot be fragmented like what we used to be, where we adopted very much an inside-out approach. Every agency does their own stuff, but if you think of it as a citizen, all you care about is dealing with one government, not 70 agencies. That drives you crazy. So why can't we give a one government approach? So today, if you come to Singapore's Life SG, you'll find that many of our life journeys are in there. And it's a one-stop shop whereby you're able to fulfill that need to deal with the government in the most effective and efficient way. We took the same concept and brought it to business, whereby, again, we were able to pull the moments of life of a business together and have a single approach. So starting a business, running a business, growing a business, going international, even like shutting down a business, etc. So I give one example. In the past, let's say you start a business, for example. Let's say you want to open a restaurant. You have to go to 8 agencies to get licenses. You'll be surprised, huh? You need fire safety license, food hygiene license, all kinds of other licenses in there. And by the time you reach the 4th agency, you'll get totally frustrated because you will have keep keying in the same fields over and over again. And we realized that to start a restaurant, you need to probably populate nearly 800 fields of data for the government, because every agency asks you for the same data and more. Today with Go Business, one-stop approach, you say, I want to start a restaurant, ask you a couple of questions, and then we pull the data directly from the relevant agencies that already has your data. And then we apply for the license as a batch. So if you need 8 licenses, we advise you that you need these 8 licenses. You apply for it, and all of a sudden you're ready to go. And we maintain that in the database with your account. When the license expires, we'll prompt you. Payment is a single payment gateway. And all of a sudden you'll find that this isn't a chore anymore. It's something that's quite easy to do. So Go Business is important. We are doing that, the same thing for grants, especially when you're growing your business and trying to go international. We will advise you what kind of grants to apply for, what you qualify for, and then again, from the back end, pull up all the data that you need, and then here you go, you got your grants. The last thing in that on that center slot is about digital workplace. We find that for a government to be digital, the employees have to be digital themselves. And it's strange, like, it's almost like you're going to fight a modern war and you find that your employees are using sticks and stones, right? It doesn't work that way. So we actually started a group to focus on the digital workplace for the employees in government to really, digitalize the way we interact in the government, especially in this virtual working environment or hybrid working environment that more and more we have. The digital workplace is critical. And again, all these things leverage on the stack that I talked about just now in the slide before, the infrastructure, the tech stack, the commercial cloud, the trust-based architecture, government data architecture, and the SIoT and robotics platform, right? So this is kind of a very good summary slide to show that in the future, in fact, it's really now in Singapore, government needs to go this direction. And I was just talking to some of your colleagues here. I just came back from Australia, right? I spent the last 1 week in Australia, in Canberra, and in New South Wales, and fantastic discussion. And I'm just very glad that your government is very much going on to the same direction. And that's the reason why we're trying to share and help each other out, and as much as possible, move towards a one government approach as we move forward. So I will just probably stop here and take any questions if there are, because I know in the interest of time, there are other people coming behind us. And if there are a couple of questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Chow Ho, thank you. It's always wonderful how someone can take such a complex scenario and simplify and break it down for us. So thank you. If anyone has any questions for Chow Ho, can you please pop them into the chat? And just while we're waiting for that, Jane, I'd imagine you might have a question to ask.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you so much, Chow Ho. I was just wondering if you could anticipate what the future means. If the future is already here in Singapore, as you might have mentioned then, what are the tough ones that you're now looking at introducing?
You know, Jane, the thing is that it never ends, right? So when we talk about like Live SG and Go Business, etc., I think we've only started, right? One of the most difficult thing, you know, we keep talking about the future in terms of like AI and blockchain and all that wonderful Web 3.0 and all that stuff. I think they're relevant to keep track of, but the reality I think we face is that digitalizing the government is a lot more difficult than most people think. So, for example, when we talk about Live SG, for example, putting all the services together, you are essentially dealing with a whole bunch of legacy backends. And the ability to make this, to so-called make them microservices that can be easily so-called combined together into a good user journey, is a lot more difficult than you think. And these things will take years. You look at Australia, for example, when you talk about national digital identity, I think we will still be talking about this in the next 5 years. Honestly, it won't be done. I can bet you it won't be done. Not because it's of incompetence, it's because it's so complex for a country and a government to do that. So my view of the future and innovation is really about how do we try and test the technology in the most innovative way, rather than always chasing the newest technology out there, because that will take time. And a lot of times it usually leads to very small achievements, if you ask me. The current technology itself is really good enough, if you ask me, for most intents and purpose. And then, you know, as the new things come about, we just add it in, right, as you go forward. Thanks.
I agree.
Thanks. And Chow Ho, we've got a question from Nikki around the convergence of using platforms and whether that creates a honeypot effect of single points of failure across the digital ecosystem. For example, when the digital identity layer has an outage, will there be more services that will be unavailable? And how do you manage that risk?
Yeah, and that's why the cloud is quite important. You know, one of the challenges that people don't realize is that managing service levels and all these things requires a lot of sophistication at the infrastructure level. And to be very honest with you, despite the massive data centers that most government have, actually we can't do that. Our track record is horrible. So I rather we use either a very good cloud provider or multi-cloud to be able to help us manage and scale those things, because the track record is so much better in the first place. There have always been questions about resiliency. This one can go on for hours if you want to talk about it. It's really about what happened if, like, Jane from AWS is a bad person that wants to cut off AWS from you guys because Joe Biden doesn't like Australia, you know, things like that. So there are many of these questions out there, but somehow or rather, if you look at it logically, our ability to leverage on the ecosystem actually helps us manage service availability and resiliency so much better than doing it ourselves. So there's a myth to think that we can do it better. The answer is I don't think we can, and that's why we need the delivery. I mean the kind of the ecosystem to help us out in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chow Ho. And Scott's asking, do you see a future state where an individual could see in one spot all of their interactions with government, you know, both as an individual citizen and as a business third-party representative?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, we are moving in that direction.
Oh.
That's the reason why Live SG and Go Business is all about. So, like, for example, in Go Business, when you transact, your entire transaction is there. All the licenses you applied for is there for you to see. And whether you need payments later on, you need renewal, etc., or new licenses comes up, etc., it's all there. We are also putting grants in there, for example, right? All the grants will be there also. We are also in the process right now of making sure that all the government filings for your company is in there also. So in a short period of time, in the next 2 or 3 years, you'll find that it's a one-stop shop whereby all your interaction with the government by a company should be there. And,
thank you, Chow Ho.
And that will be really useful for companies. For individuals, it's actually not very different. We are moving towards that direction. There are 2 things that are quite important. One is a consent platform, and the other one is a delegation platform, which I've discussed quite at length with your guys in Canberra last week. Consent is quite important because more and more so as you go forward, our ability to log your interaction with the government and the consents you've given will allow you to have a so-called a single view of the interaction with the government and how government has been using your data. And delegation is even more important because we're dealing with more and more old people who are not comfortable in digital. So they want to delegate, but there must be a safe way of delegation, either to your family members or next of kin, etc. But this delegation platform will require our ability to alert you when somebody transact on your behalf, as well as the consent that you have, in a sense, given through this person as you move forward. So I think we're getting there.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick question, if you do. Julian asks, to realize your vision, did you need to also change Singapore's approach to digital delivery? And if so, how's it going? Any tips?
You know, in 2014, our Prime Minister kind of launched the Smart Nation initiative. And he did it for a couple of reasons, right? I think the first reason is that he's a firm believer that if you really want the country as a whole to become digital, the government has to take the lead. The government has to show that it can be done, and also kind of like fertilize the ecosystem with the right data, as well as interaction with government to be able to make that happen. So that's one very important thing to understand. The second thing that was, I think, quite important is really very much a mindset, a change management process. And that's why education is quite important, right? And you notice I mentioned quite a fair bit about government to employees, our own employees, because if you can't change the mindset of your own employees, which is a huge bunch of people, then it's quite hard to change the mindset of the rest of the country, right? So, and that's why we made it very clear that we need to make sure that our own people are digitally very savvy, and that digitalization is not something to be feared, but more to be appreciated and used as we go forward. But it also means there's one more thing which I want to put in there, which is, you notice I mentioned my first slide that we had close to more than 1,000 engineers. It's not that we want to build everything. We also want to use that as the way to transform the tech ecosystem within Singapore, right? All of a sudden, we are no more just dumb buyers going out there with a contract, right? Our engineers are challenging the ecosystem every step of the way, whether it's the cloud providers, whether it's the system integrators, etc. We are out there pushing the boundaries as much as we can. Once you do that, all of a sudden, everybody got to level up. And when everybody level up, you'll find that you probably have a better chance of success as a country, rather than just a small couple of departments in the government as you go forward. So I think this is how we've kind of approached it over the years.
Chia Ho, thank you for your insights and for sharing not only the international perspective, but your own thoughts on this topic. I really appreciate your time with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you are interested, we will of course be recording the session today, but if you're interested in some more of Chia Ho's thinking, there is a video on the Amazon Institute website around the public sector modernization in Singapore, putting users first. So, and I understand it's one of the top access videos on the website. So I'll send a link for that in the chat shortly. Thank you, Chia Ho.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so it's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Michael Roseman from QUT. Michael is the director of our Centre for Future Enterprise and a professor of innovation systems at the Business School. He is a very well-researched academic, and he's the author and editor of 7 books and more than 300 refereed papers. And his areas of research are corporate innovation, ecosystems, revenue resilience, process management, and trust management. His work is focused on creating compelling future worlds with today's possibilities that make current practices obsolete. So as a researcher and advisor to boardrooms and senior executives, he's committed to advancing research-informed knowledge and confidence in order to appreciate the emerging design space and to create an increased sense of ambition. And with that note, Michael, we look forward to your words on innovation as usual. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate your kind introduction. And Jane, thank you so much to you and the entire team at AWS for giving us this stage time. Ladies and gentlemen, I will continue where Chia Ho just stopped. And that's the idea of, yes, we have new tool sets, we've got new data sets, but ultimately it might be the mindset and the skill set that matters. So in the next half an hour or so, I want to take you on a bit of a journey based on our research experiences across the sector, and in particular globally, to highlight where we believe the future will be. And the future will be the coexistence of running today and continuously exploring tomorrow. And I'd like to highlight by stating that digital is not a means to an end. We are blessed that digital will mean an end to many existing roadblocks. In the past, we couldn't dream up a scenario like the one-stop portal to access or government services that Xiaohao just talked about, but today we can. So I like to highlight, it's not the digital maturity that matters, but it's what we do with it. And if digital truly means the end to previous roadblocks, the new roadblock is our ambition. So full of confidence, and I think rightly so, Xiaohao just talked about, yes, we will have one place when I can access all government services. Maybe there will be one place when I can access all services that matter to me, no matter if they're public or private services. So it is our ambition. And I want to give you some examples, but before I start, what you see right now is a car that probably was built 100 years ago. And if 100 years ago you ordered this car and wanted this car colored in blue, it would take the manufacturer, General Motors, for example, 37 days to manually, with paintbrush, paint this car. There was a gentleman with a big ambition called Charles Kettering. And when he asked his engineers, they did what engineers do. They look at today, analyze today, and offered him 30 days as an improvement. And that's how we trained as an analyst. We unpack today and explore what we can fix. Charles wasn't happy with this. And very much like Xiaohao said, give me one-stop shop access to all services, Charles said, give me a single day to paint a car. He had to look far outside his own workforce, worked with DuPont, invented spray paint, and ultimately was able to color the cars of his engineers while he had lunch with them. So when they returned from lunch, couldn't even find their cars. That shows it is ambition that matters. And what we've learned, no matter where we are, as a private or public sector organization, as a leader or team manager, there are three reasons why we change. We have to, we can, or we want to. I will not talk about the first one, we have to change. Now, sometimes that's what needed, and as Xiaohao highlighted, COVID was an incredible accelerator and amplifier of change. But ultimately, what we do is we act quickly to have the business being able to continue to run. And that's why we explored online in the public sector or in our very own university. What is more interesting, because it's more voluntary, are the other two types of change. The changes that occur because we're curious or because we are ambitious. And organizations that can handle both the business as usual and the innovation as usual will be able to always explore today's and tomorrow's opportunities. Let me give you one example for a sense of curiosity from your very own sector. If you travel to Estonia, what they've done, they try to work out that when we have a citizen who's, for example, speeding, and we have a typical monetary fine, that the amount of money we charge, of course, is of different relevance depending on your salary. A sense of curiosity means you run an experiment, you give it a go, you see what's possible, you definitely learn, and you maybe implement what you've tried. So what they did is that depending on how fast you were going, they would literally enforce that you had to wait for 45 or 60 minutes. Now, initially, of course, this is very people consuming and they needed 10 or 12 officers. But in today's extremely digitalized environment, whether it's IoT, video analytics, you could easily craft solutions to enforce this. Now, what you see here is one big experiment. And if you go to the webpage, you see on the bottom right, OPSI, you find a long, long list of innovative public sector case studies, just like this one. For every of these cases, the conditions for success are described. And what stands out here is, this is not just interesting because of its innovative potential and the use of digital technologies. It is interesting because it required courageous leadership. You try a solution that nobody has ever tried before. What's the appetite to be a first mover? That's one prerequisite. The second one is we have to be able to learn. So when we do innovation, when we do something completely new, we need to quickly work out if it works, and if it works or if it fails, why? So experimentation, control groups, statistical significance measures, they all matter, but they're typically underdeveloped in organizations. And while they might be able to craft or prototype an idea, the ability to learn from it, to redo, revise, and then rescale is typically underdeveloped. So again, sense of curiosity is when you run your own little sandpit, when you craft something that is minimum viable, and you try to work out what's possible, and if it fails, then at least you learned. This is not the case when we talk about a sense of ambition. A sense of ambition is if a leader like Joe says, I want to have the one-stop shop access point to all your services and data by that amount of time. Failing is not an option. Albert Bourla, CEO of Pfizer, in March 2020 said, now that COVID is a global pandemic, we have an obligation to provide the world with a vaccine. But it can't be 10 years, it needs to be 9 months. For those who are interested, he just published a book called Moonshot. And in this book, he unpacks not only how his very big ambition, 9 months to the launch of a tested and effective vaccine, but also a lot of micro ambitions along the way helped. Now understand, not each of you in the audience runs and shapes the ambition of the entire department, let alone Australia's government of the future. But it's a micro ambition that counts. And so what Albert did relentlessly in his meetings, when someone said, we can produce 1 million, he would ask, what about 2 million? When someone said 4 weeks, he would ask, what about 1 week? So I encourage you to scale down, but be ambitious in terms of your very own environment and what could be done. When I was the head of school, my very own information system school here at my university, I said, why don't we run our school like a dry cleaner? Whatever gets dropped off by 10 can be picked up at 4. Leave requests, purchase requests, any sort of inquiry. So in an ambition, you try to craft a North Star and try to remove roadblocks to this ambition as opposed to fixing today. Sometimes an ambition is not about where you want to be, but what you don't want to have anymore. The former Chancellor of Germany made a very ambitious move in 2011 when she said that Germany will exit post what happened in Japan, nuclear energy by this year. Now, in response, yes, there's a significant energy challenge right now, but Germany is also, despite the fact that the country only has 3 hours of average sunshine per year, one of the global leaders in the space of renewable energies. So when the notion is there won't be any paper anymore, there won't be a second channel, there won't be any redundancy anymore. These are big ambitions that trigger innovation. And the more digital technologies eliminate roadblocks, the more space is freed up for entering new destinations. I give you 4 very quick examples. Chahao talked about a restaurant, and we studied this as well here with the Queensland government. We call this the proactive government. The idea is, and this is what happens in the digital environment, the user doesn't come to you, you come to them. The idea of live events, circumstances where I, for example, want to open a restaurant and the services are provided and proactively either suggested or even executed to me. If I become the father of a new child, maybe the government in the future will immediately register my child or pre-enroll it in my local school. So the proactive government is faster than its citizens. And very much like I can say, play Italian dinner music and Spotify provides me, I will do the same so-called semantic search in the future with government services. I don't find the document that I need. I just articulate the live event that occurred in my life. And the government of the future will take part in the life of its citizens. Second, here in Brisbane, as most of you will know, we're the proud host of the Olympic Games in 10 years. The ambition that has now been articulated is we want to make Brisbane the most inclusive games ever. What does it mean? Well, maybe you swim 50 meters in any pool in the world on the day of the 50-meter freestyle competition. But by them, whether it's IoT, blockchain solutions, other smart devices, smart precincts, we might be able to track your performance. And maybe, yes, 8 will compete for a gold medal, but maybe 40,000 will take part in these Olympics. And this is a big, bold ambition. Again, as a leader, you encourage your team to try to work out how we get there as opposed to how we fix something. And this is whether it's Charles Kettering 100 years ago, Albert Bourla last year energized their troops to get what seems to be impossible done. Third, in a group of global cities, we crafted what we called City 5.0. The idea of smart, frictionless consumption. And the notion is that the future city is livable because it comes without any constraints. Again, the ambition is to remove constraints. For example, you might live in suburbia, but it doesn't exclude you from access points that previously were only available physically to be accessed in the middle of the city. When we had recently, a few years ago, a ballet performance, those who lived in rural Queensland were excluded. Now, what happened here is the performance was streamed online to 16 locations. And no matter where you were, you had access to these 16 locations, and you didn't have to show up in your black tie and spend $200 per ticket. If you are visually impaired, or maybe voice-enabled services allow you that independent of your personal constraints to access government services, and maybe you don't have to be there by 5 p.m., but an environment of robotic workflows, chatbots, and other solutions, we're able to provide services without any time constraints. Now, what you witness, whether it's Barcelona, Buenos Aires, or Brisbane, cities have a call to design a future city, a city that is free of constraints, very much like Chahao talked about, the Singaporean government wants to be free of any type of redundancy in terms of data or channels. And last but not least, I'd like to encourage you to work out what is your personal ambition. And a personal ambition, as I just highlighted, doesn't have to be an act of tremendous creativity. You can ask yourself, what can I eliminate? Where can I scale? Where could I be like Amazon or Spotify? Or in this case, Where can I do more with what I have? Look at Uber. Uber gave the world crowdsourced mobility services. And yes, they started with people. But once they understood that the process works, and yes, crowdsourced mobility is possible, they added food, and Uber Eats was created. And they partnered with Qantas, and now passengers can book an Uber. In the United States, healthcare service providers, yes, call an Uber for their patients. And as you know, whether it's the potato somulis or parcels that otherwise will go via Australia Post can be delivered via Uber. So Uber did nothing else than working out what else can we do with an existing capability. And the same is what Amazon did once they understood how to buy, store, sell, and ship books. Now, I encourage you, don't ask yourself what's broken, ask yourself what's possible with what you have already. And that's the difference between the leader, the digital experience that is centered on further automating today, and the experience that crafts a new goalpost for tomorrow. So, in summary, an ambition is nothing else like a significant but quite realistic hypothesis. Can we provide Olympics that are truly inclusive? Could we, as a university, dramatically scale up? It is a continuous goalpost for actions. When the biggest insurer had the ambition of having only one claims engine, and this had to be a zero-touch claim, every single activity was focused on process, standardization, and the elimination of human touchpoints. So what we learned is the compelling ambitions these days become possible because of the maturity of digital solutions, plus they lead to achievements in the private and the public sector that previously were unthinkable. Now, if you compare this, that might remind you to what my colleague, Professor Marek Kovakiewicz, talked about in session 1. And he used the terminology of digitizing within what you do, and it's largely the automation of what's going on. This is when you do a digital transformation that is very much push. You look at today and eliminate paper, as opposed to the digitalization, the pull towards something completely new. Now, if it's a sense of ambition, I don't have data, I don't have reports, I need a strong, compelling story. I need to work out what are the opportunity points, not just the pain points. I need to be a very good designer, not just a strong analyst. And we need what we call opportunity appetite statements. This is less about what we try to avoid, but what we like to explore. What's the willingness to work with a GovTech provider as a complementary resource? What's the willingness to create an entirely new service for our citizens? Or what's our appetite to explore the possibilities of artificial intelligence, like my colleague, Professor Kevin D'Souza, talked about. Now, if you see these two sides, the left is what we understand exceptionally well. The right is a tremendous opportunity. And in our very own experiences, when we're part of projects, what we learned is that the left is very much the business as usual, and it's often challenging but needed. While the right one, for those who are comfortable with ambitions, is truly, truly source of excitement. And if you're able to excite your individual team members, then it is the mindset that changes, as my previous speaker just talked about. And we measure this by simply walking the corridor and asking people how they are. And once the answer is not, I'm busy, but the answer is, I'm excited because I work on a single one-stop shop solution, then you truly conduct the cultural change that is the bedrock for your digital journey. We summarize this in a very simple model. Below the line is what you see, what we call a hygiene factor. Now, I remember being in Canberra at Centrelink. We talked about MyGov, and I got asked what I thought. And I said, well, that's a tremendous big step for Centrelink. But in honesty, probably a small step for Australians, because we expect that a single entrance point into various government services does exist. So the challenge here is we give citizens what they expect. And of course, the requirements often grow faster than our capabilities. Above the line, the green line is a source of ambition, of excitement. Above the line, it's design intensive. Below the line, it's analysis intensive. Higher education. Below the line is when we digitize our learning experiences and provide online learning. Above the line is when we sell a degree like a piece of software that is version management, can be upgraded, and our students would never expire, but like versions would update their degrees and would always have the contemporary knowledge that they require. Now, none of our alumni ever asked for an upgradable degree, but our sense of curiosity tells us we need to explore if there's a market for it, and can we truly be ahead of the demand curve? And I encourage you to work out how can you work above the line. Now, we do this in our day-to-day projects. What you see here is the design of a room that we call the nest. And what we have done is we write down on one side today, and on the other side, we write down the future. And it could be in 20 days, could be 20 months, it could be 2025. And then with a tape, we have a demarcation. And if you're to the right, then yes, you look at today's business, at today's challenges, and we try to fix what is broken. And if you take into the other room, you're not allowed to use any of these terminologies. It's all about working out what's possible. And in every single project we had so far, we always started in the left, in the green half. Once our team members, once our customers understood where we could be, there was so much excitement in the room that today became obsolete. In some projects, we had this entire journey run in 20 days. We spent the first week on understanding the process, what's going on, what are ambitions. In the second case, in the second week, we work out what are possible opportunities, what could be done, would be done. And then we converge and try to work out user perceptions, financial business cases. Before we pitch this to the executives, we then say, where could we go ahead? And that is a redesign of a process, one per month. In a project with a large insurer, we went so far, we said, we only work in the second half of the room. We assume that you could look at today, that you can buy the business analysts either on the street or you have them, and we understand and believe you can make pain go away. But how do you see what's possible? And we called this, and that's what you see here, the O room, the opportunity room. And in this opportunity room, we did nothing else and tried to work out what's the next digital opportunity, the next scientific opportunity, the next entrepreneurial opportunity. What else can we do with the assets that we have at our disposal? The way we work here, again, not too intensive on creativity, we provide big frameworks. So let's say in the world of digitization, in the first wave, we digitized organizations and automate processes, let's say RPA or chatbots. In the second wave, the focus moves from us to the people, the students, the patients, the citizens. and our devices have empowered citizens much more than they've empowered us. Then we recognize that things become smarter, and finally, data will make decisions. In a project with a bank, but you can replicate this in your own environment, we crafted the following. So if I jump to the economy of people and ask ourselves, how do we empower people? We said, if our customers already give us their money, what else would they trust us with? Could we provide the private data cloud to people? Could we become the most trusted entity that takes care of all the digital assets that matter to our customers or citizens? And that's, of course, fueled by the new capability called cybersecurity. Then we ask ourselves, what does the world of IoT do to us? And you can say, we are not here to fix a problem, we're here to identify an opportunity. So we asked ourselves, if things become autonomous, become smarter, can make decisions, will we have what we call B2T, business to things? And I personally believe that cars will buy car insurance before they drive on their own, because it's so much easier to implement. So this insurance company and bank prepared a call center for the day that a car and not a human wants a quote for home insurance or car insurance. And last but not least, we ask ourselves, in the world of data, information, and highly capable algorithms, what will happen to the digital world? And we crafted what we call intelligent money. Money that is smarter than me, money that knows how my bank statement looks like next week, and money that has a higher financial literacy than I do, money that, if needed, like my car, will hit the brakes before I do. Now, the data bank, the car that goes shopping, or the intelligent money are all solutions that were born out of using digital emerging technologies as a catalyst for entire new value. None of these three value propositions could have been derived from design thinking or having workshops with existing customers. We needed to be beyond what customers even could imagine. And then we try to work out, how do we get there? And needless to say, organizations like Combank nowadays have what they call smart money, which has features of what I just talked about. Another tool we use is this hierarchy of 30 elements of value. Now what we do is we take these new value propositions, literally put them on the table and try to work out what other types of value could we create. Again, the overall question is what's possible and not what is broken, fueled by the confidence that digitalization will allow us, one way or the other, to get there. Now, I talk about innovation as usual. What is needed as a way forward, as Matt highlighted, is we build capability. And this is not the capability to run transactions. This is the capability to execute transformations. Meaning we need to sense what's possible. We need to ideate and create. But as I highlighted, we might not need background music or table tennis tables. We need trigger points that allow us to think differently. And then we need probably entire new capabilities to scale, to test, and with statistical significance to learn before we build. It is typically not a business case that is monetary, but it's the ability to understand, is it desired? Is it technically, legally, ethically feasible? And is it ultimately, when it runs, viable? And that's what we call the innovation process, or the capability that constitutes our continuous innovation capability. Some companies, the water provider here in Brisbane, Urban Utilities, create a whole governance scheme around it, and appointed a chief opportunity officer who's doing nothing else than scanning, nurturing, and initiating these possibility-driven initiatives. Now, in summary, what I encourage you to do is ensure that the skill set that is needed exists in your organization, because the gap between what we know and what's feasible will get bigger. To the left of this picture, the world was problem-rich. To the right, it's opportunity-rich. And the stack that Xiaohao just talked about showed you the richness of the feasibilities. I call this the Truman Effect. And for those who've seen the Truman Show, Truman, famous for its line, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and in case I don't see you, good night, was a very happy chap. And he was happy because he did know what he did not know. And that's the biggest challenge in our digital journeys. So what organizations need to do is they need to build digital intelligence, the ability with literacy to develop using digital technologies, to understand what constitutes ethical and compliant behavior, and make this an elegant, aesthetically beautiful solution. An organization we work with has 20,000 employees around the world and is an engineering company. And they built a digital driver license. 60-hour program, voluntary, but if you don't have a digital driver license, projects and promotions might occur without you. A driver license expires every 3 years. And this program was made available to the workforce in collaboration with universities and other service providers. So, in summary, I very much believe that digital technologies will less and less become the bottleneck, and we move from tool set and data set to skill set and mindset as the new challenges. Organizations will no longer have an excuse to say they are busy, but they need to ensure well-resourced that possibilities are explored. And this will in particular mean the ability to perform in the second half, and that will require a lot of digital intelligence. I leave it there. I really, really appreciate the opportunity and like to thank Matt and Jane again, but also appreciate your attention here. And I'm sure we have a few moments for a bit of a Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. And yes, we have a few moments for some questions. So please type your questions in the chat window for Michael. And I have one for you to kick off, Michael. In organizations, I think one of the observations I have is the challenge of trying to make space for innovation as usual, as opposed to business as usual, which sometimes is the stuff that's top of your inbox. What tips do you have for us? One I saw there was the dedicated role, but if we don't have that role, what tips would you have for organizations to refocus?
So, I think we see two types of organizations. Those organizations that have a strong desire to change. So you could see the excitement with this. Xiaohao was confident that yes, there will be at one point one place. Now, if you don't have a compelling leader, it could be the pressure, and that's what we call the opportunity cost. So, with other words, if you don't act, someone else will act. Many of you might be familiar with Code for America, Code for Australia, where citizens said, I'm not just voting for a government, I have arms and brains, and I could create my own solutions. If the government doesn't give me what I want, well, maybe we as a community build what we want. And maybe it's a private organization and not a public organization. So if we don't act, someone else might act. And I think what is true for the private sector, at least in parts, might also be true for the public sector.
Thank you, Michael. So if there's any curious moments that you're having or any questions you have, please type them into the chat. We'll allow a moment for that. typing. If people are like me, I'm sure their minds are spinning with ideas. So thank you, Michael.
I might have a shot. It's Jane here, Michael. Your presentation and commitment to ambition is fantastic. I'm also sort of wondering when as a public servant, I would go back to my desk or office and face, you know, all of the challenges of actually having business as usual run smoothly, and also try and sort of work out who has which of the leaders up the chain am I going to try and sort of encourage to be part of this whole movement. What would you recommend?
Yeah. So first of all, sometimes it doesn't mean you have to look up. Maybe you look down and craft your own little micro ambition in your own environment. So it doesn't have to mean the whole of Australia or the whole of the Olympics. In your very own microcosmos, ask yourself what could be done. It could be a very simple statement, but I would start with what I call micro ambitions. Not all of us will invent the next COVID vaccine. Second, we need to find a way to resource this. And the danger that we are so busy being busy, of course, is a massive roadblock. And if I'm too busy, the question is, do I find entire new resources where people could work on this? And what we realize sort of, if you as a leader can unlock excitement, you will be surprised how much excitement can do in terms of outcomes, efficiency, and an overall boost of productivity. And that is something that we shouldn't underestimate. So the mindset that previously was spoken about as well is, for me, that sort of the hidden catalyst for many successful projects.
Yeah, I think it is definitely micro ambitions is a much better term than skunk works, which
Yes.
it definitely created the enthusiasm as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And Michael, Sanjay's just popped in the chat, I think, a really nice summary of where the group is at, which is you've already put us in the future state. So thank you for that. I think as you helped us to refocus from, you know, how do we fix this to how do we get there?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a appropriate juncture then for us to just take a quick break. I'd like to say thank you again to Michael. And we're just going to take a 5-minute break, and we will be back at 3:55 on the dot for our panel on co-design with a sense of ambition. So please do take the time to grab a cuppa, take a break, and we'll see you in 5. So, welcome back all. We're all enjoying a nice cuppa. It's my pleasure in the last part of our last module to introduce you back to Jane Treadwell from Amazon Web Services to chair our panel on co-design with a sense of ambition. Really looking at the real cases on how we do this. Jane, as you'll remember, is AWS's lead advisor in government transformation for Asia Pacific and Japan. And she's built a career driving and advising in citizen-centric and technology-enabled government transformation. Roles including Centrelink's inaugural CIO and then its deputy CEO for business transformation, the Victorian State Government CIO and CEO of DesignGov. In 2015, Jane joined the World Bank and ran its digital development global practice and joined AWS in 2020, from where she comes to us today. So welcome, Jane, and we're looking forward to our panel. Thank you. Oh, and you've got your mute on.
Thank you, Matt. And in AWS, there's actually a cap, a baseball cap that says you've got your mute on. And I'm trying to get hold of one. Look, I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this panel, and especially after such fantastic keynotes from Michael Russman and Chao Ho Chan, that it sort of sets the, as this is described, the sense of ambition and opportunity, and also explore the sort of the nature of co-design, because it's not so simple as sort of going off and devising a policy and putting it up to the minister and getting it getting the funds and the resources to implement. There's a much more expansive approach to now, not just solving problems, but also looking at possibilities, as we've just heard. I do remember learning a lot about design thinking when I was in DesignGov, and certainly liked the notion that solving a wicked problem is fundamentally a social process where you have to understand and involve the controllers, the influencers, and the impacted in order to move beyond the problem to the prospects and possibilities. And I think we'll be exploring a range of both the challenges, the enablers, the blockers, and the collaborative processes to actually get your hands around some of those challenges, but also to look for the ways in which, in speaking with our panelists today, they have been able to deploy co-design approaches and collaborative systems to get to that aspirational state. What I'll do is introduce each panelist as they begin their sort of respond to a question from me and their 10 minutes. And we hope to have at the end of that period at least 10 minutes for conversation and debate or discussion. Although having had the chance to speak with our panelists, I think we're all in ferocious agreement, but let's see what I can do to actually challenge that sort of state. Our first speaker and panelist is Jonathan Thorpe, who's the Acting Deputy CEO in Services Australia for Customer Service Design. He's had a grand career. He joined Services Australia in December last year, but prior to that was the key person in and General Manager for Digital Identity, MyGov, and Sourcing in DTA. He's had the experience of delivering a large number of big initiatives across digital experience, identity, biometrics, looking at contact centres, whole of government transformation design, design and domains. And he comes to us today responsible for end-to-end design of a full range of the social security programs and services delivered by Services Australia, and is very familiar with working across boundaries in government as well as beyond government. So Jonathan, welcome. And perhaps we could start off with me asking you and quoting Steve Jobs, who said that people thought design is what it looks like, but really it's about how it works. As governments strive to become more people-centered, can you sort of give us your experience and an example of where co-design has delivered the outcomes needed?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. So I'd certainly agree with the sentiments. It's certainly not just what it looks like. And one of the things that I think I've seen in a number of the larger programs I've had the pleasure of working on across government is that recognition or a necessity to look at it from a service design perspective. In other words, essentially looking at all the various elements that you need to have in place to bring it to life or understand what's currently in the environment and not working. So it's everything from looking, front and backstage, but the people that currently support the process, the resourcing, the infrastructure, obviously, yes, the UX, the front end, but unless you're starting to look at the underpinnings of what holds all that together, and in government, certainly as you started to touch on the policy or regulatory aspects, you're actually not going to improve the experience for folk. So certainly approaching these types of wicked problems, which is my attraction to government. That's why I'm here, because there's plenty of them and we still haven't fixed all of them. So if you guys want to help, please come in, is to start looking at, well, how do you look at that from a holistic perspective? How do you look at it from a systems thinking perspective? What's the cause and effect of what you're about to change and have its inherent impact on the system itself? Noting that as large as Services Australia is, and the agency I work for now is Australia's largest service delivery engine. Jane knows this, she's been here before. But we also work with other government departments too. So changing things on our own will have downstream impacts to real customers. It'll also have impacts to policy objectives across government. So the need to undertake co-design and approach that from looking at all the aspects across government is just crucial. And I've seen that on a couple of different examples. And a more practical one, just to start with, Jane, I had spent some time at the tax office. I had responsibility for some design stuff there. It was a cool job, really cool, looking after their the front end experience and a lot of their social media and marketing and what have you. But one of the interesting things that was of a particular interest at the time, based on stakeholders and users, customers, was the fact that the ATO had an awful time communicating with people. And the website was awfully hard to understand and the letters weren't much better. In fact, I think they were probably the worst part of it. But very quickly, when you start co-design processes, you start talking to tax agents, tax agency. If you don't know, the ATO tax and super system have a fairly strong hold on that place. And so they'll tell you a certain need and want, if you will. But then often you start talking to real customers and you find it's very different. You find that stakeholder representation isn't always representative of the real customer or users. And then you've got the regulatory aspects of the tax and super system, which you still need to maintain an obligation to and make sure that it's working in concert with its legislative and policy objectives. Getting everyone into a room, Jane, getting everyone into a room to kind of understand where the current pain points are for the various customer types or actors that you've got service responsibility for, because in government, you don't get to choose who your customers are. And understanding where they're coming from and being able to kind of test concepts with them. There's various iterations of a design process, if you will, but some of that's just starting with that listening piece and hearing from where those particular customers are coming from. The outcomes of those processes I had the pleasure of working on were data sharing objectives, which sound a bit kind of back end, but they make a big difference to the front end experience of people, like single touch payroll. Most people that receive a salary and wage these days on their payslip know exactly how much super has been taken out by their employer. Some years ago, you did not know, and it'd take until the end of the year until you'd find out a problem there. Conversely, you'd hear a lot of taxpayers who try to do the tax return themselves that have no idea what the tax office is talking about. There's ATO community now, crowdsourced community-based content based on the way that people talk about the tax and super system, not tax agents. Co-designing with real customers, generate the products and services they need and ensure that you can do your darndest best to meet the requirements of all of them. Probably the other one, Jane, I'm not sure if I'm on time or not, but the more wicked problem, the one I've enjoyed the most in my career is probably digital identity. I think you and I met through those circles, and certainly the notion of proving who you are is a fundamental pain point globally. And often in developing countries, it's the first step to even get access to basic things like healthcare, education. It's such an important thing to do. And even in Australia, we haven't got it right. You know, it's pretty hard to prove who you are. And even if you do, it only works for one place. You often have to tell someone else who you are all over again. It's not transferable. So I was working with the DTA on something called the Digital Identity Program. It was trying to look at that whole of economy problem, which is how might we ask who Jane is, but she stay in control of that information and provide it to who she needs to based on a service she wants, so a value proposition, if you will. You know, that co-design process was a wicked problem because what government needs is very different to what the banking sector needs, for example, or what individuals need versus small businesses, or if you're dealing with remote communities or First Nations. You know, providing basic identity documents is a very big problem. So just throwing digital identity to remote Australia or regional Australia doesn't fix the problem. So that was probably one of the best examples where I saw a genuine co-design process that needs to iterate over many cycles to look at various challenges to crack through what is still a wicked problem, but it has made some considerable progress with a national framework and about 10 million people using something they can reuse across 100 services. It's a start. There's a lot more to go, but it's starting to get there. And yeah, exactly. Identity documents for homeless is a challenge, and even in national emergencies as well. If your house is flooded or it catches on fire, I don't think you've got your birth certificate. So being able to reuse some digital representation of you to try and get access to basic things like emergency payments, absolutely critical.
Fantastic. You've covered a lot of ground in those few minutes. I'm not sure if you were able to listen to Michael Russman just earlier and Chao Ho Chan, who are all sort of gearing up the audience to be super ambitious in terms of the sort of the prospects that are possible, and really the fact that digital solutions and capabilities put the boundaries of possibility much closer for many. I guess the follow-up in terms of what you've just said and how you bring those stakeholders together, you know, and perhaps we can use the digital identity or what you're doing with Services Australia now is it dealing with a broken system that you're dealing with, or actually putting forth the prospect of how people might deal with government or interact with government? And how do you manage and balance those challenges?
Yeah, well, I think it is a balance. I certainly think it is a balance, Jane. Working in government, I don't think I'd turn up to say it's broken. I think, as I've encouraged, I can see many people on this Zoom call, we've got some wicked problems. We haven't fixed them all. We need your help. But it is a very complex system. And so that therefore means it's quite hard to navigate. And certainly my more recent experience in Services Australia in the current role I'm in is really looking at some of those fundamental problems or challenges with social welfare and the policy settings around it. You know, if you start to look at some of the technology enablement that we have on our doorstep today, and as an agency, we have these things, you know, so modern platforms that allow you to communicate with customers in a far more contemporary sense than what government's used to doing, which is sending letters and calling people. Yeah, we have those things in place, and we're starting to test those and roll those out where we can. But, you know, basic capability that's already in market today around personalization or proactive tailoring of services based on customer context, which is great from a marketing perspective and can see some great value proposition in a government context. I'll assure you some of the policy settings at the moment in the social way, and you'd know this, Jane, from your previous time here, you know, I'm not able to send you a text message right now. Technology will enable me to do it, to tell you, or instant message to say, we've looked at your circumstances, you've consented to provide the information to us, because building that trust and consent is really important up front. And based on your circumstances, we think this welfare payment might be better for you. Now, it sounds great, but currently the policy settings doesn't allow that to happen. So part of it's looking at how we work with policy agencies on both the policy intent behind some of the objectives, I've also got responsibility for emergency payments. And just before this, we came on a discussion around biosecurity, for example. But it's looking at all these kind of policy objectives and then understanding, well, how do they actually work on the ground? And what are the implications, both from an operational or a service delivery perspective? And then how do customers react to that? And making sure there's a feedback loop to policy so we can go upstream to try and address those fundamental challenges is probably where I'm spending a lot of my time at the moment. And it's just such a massive opportunity because, again, the technology is on our doorstep and government's procured that. It's actually thinking about how we use policy differently and working with policy partners around looking at a customer holistically, looking at the system holistically. And as I said in my earlier conversation, when you asked me the question around, is it just the front end, working across government? You know, a lot of folk have probably heard the term life events before. I mean, I describe it internally, particularly to the frontline staff, is just stuff that happens to people.
Yeah.
So looking for work, finding a job, supporting my loved ones, things like that. It requires a number of government agencies to come together to solve those problems. You know, Service Trade can do a bit of it, fair bit of it, but there's still a lot that needs to be done across government. So to work together on a shared understanding of how we approach service policy, to be able to design patterns the same way. So yeah, sometimes unfortunately you've got to go to different government departments, but you don't need to relearn how to engage with them. The form's not completely different. Things like that can make a huge difference and some of the focus at the moment.
Thank you. And in fact, one of the participants in the program, I think in the first module, actually asked whether I thought policy, service, strategy, operations, frontliners all should be in that one room you were talking about.
Yeah.
And I thought the answer to that is yes. And then you have to actually do that full on, both, I think, from hearing Michael, both the analytical but also the design side. So
I think you've got to prove points, Jane. You've got to come back regularly on this, right? So this is, you know, an agile mindset, but it's also kind of iterating. So, you know, we understand it's a wicked problem, but what can we practically do right now with the resources available to us at this point in time, both policy, people, and technology, and constantly come back to show how we're moving the dial on improving CX, for example, that gives us more authority or agreement to do more.
Building the social capital and political capital for change. Thanks a lot. That's fantastic. Jonathan, we'll probably come back to you for the Q&A session. Moving to Tess Bishop. Thanks a lot for joining us, Tess. You've got a grand career spanning state and federal governments and have also spent time in KPMG Europe, passionate about outcomes development and working collaboratively to achieve results. So for the audience, Tess holds a Master's in International Relations, Graduate Diploma in Business Management, Bachelor of Arts. Clearly is not averse to actually doing a whole lot of things at the same time. Tess also is a member of IAP2 Australasia, graduate of the AICD Company Board of Directors program, and has been on quite a number of boards over her career. She's currently on the board of Pathways to Resilience Trust and Townsville Port Authority. So that sort of spans quite an area of interests. So Tess, over to you. Could you just tell us how important are real people in this co-design environment? And I know we've got Jonathan still taking the screen. So Matt, just wondering if you can do your magic as well to let Tess have a go.
Yep, Tess is on now. Excellent.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I think this is such a wonderful topic, and when I was reflecting with Jane the other day, there's certainly many examples of where we have had breakthroughs and we've done co-design very well. And when I say we, I'm thinking from my time within the public sector, but I also through my career have got some experiences and from that some key learnings around where I think we can do this better. ultimately, as Jane said, it is about really having the citizen or the customer at the front of mind. And I think that we do communications, and we are improving communications and engagement and stakeholder engagement better. But I think that some of the core principles around co-design can definitely be improved. One of the things upon reflection for me in my career is around building a healthy environment for co-creation, co-design. I think about the fact that when we came at a co-design process within government, we often approach it from what department we're representing, whether we're a central agency or a line agency. And I think for me going forward now, if I was to return to the public service, I would really be focused on the individual and what the outcome is that we're trying to achieve for them, rather than necessarily having being obsessed with the policy position or the constraints of the operating environment. It's not saying that we just take those for granted. Of course, as public servants, they're important, but I think it's just a shift in mindset. It's about really doing that engagement, stakeholder engagement, really being audience and insights led, and thinking outside the square around practical solutions to systems improvement or the wicked problems that Jonathan said.
So in that sort of process test, and we heard Michael Rousman sort of really challenge us, and I think there's everyone, regardless of which sector you're working in, to actually have a set of micro ambitions, as well as sort of the think big and change the world, which is where a number of people might be attracted into the public sector to actually change the lives of Australians, say. So in that, when you have been working on some challenges in government, how is that sort of the prospects of the future versus the sort of fixing today's challenges? How has that worked for you and or the team? And to what degree does the bureaucracy have its own sort of state of play, and what do you need to have in your mindset as well as your toolkit to actually move aside the traditional processes to test and shape the boundaries of the possible?
Yeah, I think that it's great that we have participants online today, because I think that for me, it really was a change management process or a skilling process. We are so used to our routines and our systems and process within government, and I think being innovative or coming into a room where you throw the rule book out and you might, you've got your coloured sticky notes and you've got your whiteboards, and you'll have stakeholders who might be present, and it's just such a different, you're sitting down and working through solutions together and talking about real examples together in that collaborative co-design environment. I think that this is a great first step. I think that within the public sector, it is about a change management process. It is about talking about new models of problem solving and empowering the workforce and training the workforce to do that. Several years ago in the Queensland government, we had the government set core priorities, and some of them were very aspirational. And, you would stop and think, I don't know how we're going to achieve those, whether it be financial constraints. Like, you first of all come up with all of the problems, but they did put aside a room within the public sector where it was a co-design space, and you could, no matter what the topic is, we could all come together and work with our stakeholders in that room, troubleshoot, and can come up with some solutions to in a co-design process. It was very empowering, it was innovative, and it was energizing. And we came up with new ideas from everything from looking at drones, which doesn't seem so new today, but this was a few years ago, and we came up with a strategy for drone technology. We came up with looking at stuff in the social care space too, like how are we going to deal with ICE addiction and things like that. So I think that it really is about setting a culture where there's permission to do so, and also making sure that from all levels, and I noticed that someone said that we're quite senior, but I think that it was for all levels, and I made sure that our team, my whole division, everybody felt empowered and everyone was a part of the process.
Great. Yes, thank you. You reminded me of a story probably 20 years ago where the head of the roadside assistance, RAA, in South Australia, actually gave a license to all his staff that they could do anything it took to actually fix a problem that they came across, which included, on this occasion, for newlyweds who just left their reception and their car had broken down, access to a hotel with support, and their fixed up car would turn up the following day, and that was on the basis of a license. So thanks again for those points. I'd like to now move to Adrian Beer, who's the CEO of METS Ignited, an industry-led growth centre for the mining equipment, technology and services sector, funded by the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. I don't know how you do that every day, Adrian. And Adrian is an industry technology leader. He's had broad experiences across the world, over 20 years, most recently with General Electric and another industrial technology company, ABB. Passionate about collaborative transformation, business efficiency, maximising performance and efficiencies and effectiveness of operations for the benefit of all stakeholders. And we had a great conversation the other day. So thanks for that. I have had more than the time we've got today for exploring this with you. But we also talked about the barriers in the public sector that need to change. And your techniques, I suppose, it reminded me of an old nursery rhyme about climbing up, climbing over, or climbing around or through the sort of walls of resistance to create a collaborative environment for digital transformation and brilliant results that are impossible to be achieved just single-handedly. So perhaps you could sort of explore that again.
Yeah, no, thank you for the introduction. And yes, we did have it was an interesting discussion. And maybe I'll add a comment to start. I think the greater the resistance, the harder you need to look. I think sometimes we look for the path of least resistance, but I think we make significant progress when we understand why there is such a big barrier to change in certain areas. There's someone, really holding on to that status quo. So challenging that's really important. The context of the comment is seeing the impact of, I'll say, disruptive technology. And the experience at ABB was with when the company acquired Mincom, so a very famous Australian software business, ERP, asset management, workforce management application that was often a leading platform to drive a transformation within an organisation when they adopted that new technology. And there's always a resistance to change in some way, shape or form, whether it's just security, comfort, tradition. I think it sort of leads me to think about from the previous speakers around, you know, this co-design concept is not just about having representation from each of the stakeholder groups, and it isn't always the person with the most experience and the greatest history that's going to bring the most value. I think co-design also includes hierarchical considerations, new and old ways of thinking, and neither is more important, they're both equally important, because they each bring a different perspective that might inform what the solution looks like. So sometimes we either, I don't know, we assess a co-design environment based on the caliber or the hierarchy of people that attend. You know, you don't always want the senior leaders there all the time, because they can drive and dominate and dictate outcomes that maybe aren't best for everyone. Sometimes you do want them there. Sometimes you want to have the challenge sessions led from the bottom up. It's far more exciting from my experience if you bring the newest and least experienced people to be the moderators and manage the floor. It's a great learning exercise, and you get some interesting outcomes. So yeah, I think sort of touching back on one of the co-design comments I saw in the chat earlier in this session, I think it's the mix of stakeholders with experience and also with new perspectives, and then those who aren't entrenched in a certain way of doing things, plus those who understand why things are the way they are. You know, it's bringing all of those to the table to then work out, you know, what's going to serve the purpose or the intent of the design in the first place. I like Jonathan sort of talked a lot in the term of a customer, and we often do that second tier, the customer's customer. So not only the person you're trying to help, but what is it that they are trying to achieve for their stakeholders, for their loved ones, for their families. You know, what is the problem from their perspective, not from the solution provider angle. And I think taking those contexts into a co-design, and then having people who no experience in how to address that problem, plus those who've got plenty of experience doing it a certain way, you know, brings value and balance to the solution.
So just thinking, you know, Jonathan, in working with tax, DTA, social services, and now you in the science industry and technology sector. I mean, that's quite a sort of an extreme of interests, I guess. How have you been able to drive these types of approaches in such a sort of a hard environment? Or that maybe they're just my assumptions I'm making.
I'm sorry, I've just lost you for a little bit of that, Jane. So I'm not sure.
Yeah. How have you been able to drive these types of collaborations in a sort of a fairly scientific, hard environment?
Yeah, well, yeah, science and engineering are two pretty challenging areas to get creative thinking happening, though. I mean, admittedly, I think science is probably one of the most creative disciplines there is. But yeah, I think, you know, it's just that Tess mentioned it earlier about the safety and giving people freedom and comfort to bring their own different unique perspectives and not feel like, you know, everyone has to have the answer. I think those co-design spaces are key. You know, sometimes more important is the question, not necessarily, you know, the person who's got a question and understanding why, and giving someone the freedom to feel safe to ask the question. And, you know, maybe goes back to my previous comment about not always having a strong representation of leadership in these sessions as well, because sometimes people are fearful of actually sharing what they think is an unusual idea, and then also making people feel comfortable to ask the silly question, right? Because yeah, we used to say that in every digital transformation workshop, the only stupid question is the one you don't ask. So, you know, there is nothing wrong with asking a dumb question, but not asking a question, there's something very wrong with that. So really, you know, pushing people to feel safe and secure, and that, I think, breaks down a lot of barriers. Sometimes not being the smartest person in the room and asking the stupid question first helps break down the barriers. And, you know, great to get someone who's either leading a project or facilitator to start with the dumb questions or show they don't know, because, you know, that encourages people to bring ideas that they might not feel comfortable sharing amongst their peers or those that they might look up to if it's got a broad range of people in their careers.
In fact, that was my advice to vice presidents in the World Bank when they were afraid of looking stupid in front of technology companies. I said, ask a stupid question and you'll actually trip them up, probably. They'll have to actually answer it. Do you think that across all of Australia's public sectors, are we moving fast enough or ambitiously enough to actually address some of the sort of, not just the challenges, but actually thinking broadly enough about what's possible? And you know, how have you sort of approached that yourself?
But fast enough can be a dangerous question to answer, because sometimes we move too fast and then that can cause failure and then people get disenfranchised with change. You sort of think about merging systems and processes. I think about a freeway or a motorway and a car merging in. If you try to get everyone to merge at once, it doesn't work well. And I was thinking of, again, back to Jonathan's comment about all those different systems and bringing the integration of the front end of the various different government department systems, mash them all together at once, and it will fail. Yeah. And if it fails, then everyone will lose faith in the potential to achieve the outcome that everyone wants to achieve. So ambition is important, pace is important, but I think momentum is probably more important than speed. So I think maintaining momentum and also picking up after failures and getting back up again and persistence. So that, I think, is probably more important, bit of resilience and persistence to maintain momentum. But be ambitious, right? Have ambitious goals, but you know, it's a journey. It's always a journey. We've been integrating new technology, you know, for 40 or 50 years into the public sector. So there will always be a new technology. It will always have an impact on the way we do things. And I think we just need to embrace that change is going to be constant, and we just need to be steady and persistent.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your thoughts, and we'll round back to you in terms of the growing number of questions I think we're getting through the chat. Just like to move to our final speaker, Dr. Paula Dutzen, who has, if you've read her background, has a really intriguing sort of experience and area of research in looking at deviant consumer behaviour and digital transformation. I worked in correctional services once, and I thought that that's what we were trying to do, at least in the first bit, understand it. She's exploring why everyday people engage in deviant, non-compliant behaviour and designing the sort of human or digital interventions to encourage people to take more compliant, protective actions, especially in the sort of diverse domains around non-compliance with emergency warnings, tax evasion, non-compliant public record keeping, scam victimization, copyright infringement, and dis or misinformation. So what a wonderful person you would be at a dinner party, I think, Paula. So on the basis of what we've been discussing and also your sort of experiences, many people in government and observing government talk about the sort of risk-averse nature of the public sector. But what are the risks and barriers to successful digital transformation in the public sector that you have observed and tackled, and perhaps, you know, contemplating in this sort of spirit of ambition, but also stakeholder engagement and co-design? How does that work best?
Thanks so much, Jane. I'm really excited to be here this evening with everybody. I guess a bit of context as to what perspective I'm bringing, as I'm not an in-house public servant talking about projects that we've worked on in-house. I've always been brought on as an academic researcher to co-design digital transformation projects with the public sector. So any project that I've worked on has always involved academia, the public sector department that's involved, usually a tech vendor, and then sometimes some extra third party, whether that be the citizen, related organizations or stakeholders that are somehow involved in the broader process. So some of the cases that I'll share with you are from the likes of Office of State Revenue here in Queensland, looking at our tax and royalty collection for the state, as well as Queensland State Archives, some of my work with emergency services agencies as well. So I guess one of the really common barriers we came across in any of our projects, we're brought on to be like, here's the grand design, here's the grand idea of what you could do. And then we would always have people usually in the policy and leg teams come in and say, legislation doesn't allow that, or this is not how we've done it because of some long historic reason, and usually a valid reason. I think one of my panelists also mentioned, sometimes you need people there to explain why things are done in a particular way. But what we found through the process as we continue to work together, it was all well and good to acknowledge that some of those barriers were there, move past them, but then always have a plan in place for, well, if we wanted to realize this new potential future we've envisaged, does that require some kind of lobbying around changes, specifically in this case to legislation? So, for instance, we were trying to transform the way land tax was collected, because at the moment there's a lot of unclean data in who owns land. If I get married, change my name, and I have land holdings in both names, that doesn't reconcile in the systems, and therefore the state is not effectively collecting the correct tax. So interestingly, they were always reaching out with letters, and something as basic as that in the legislation, it did not allow Office of State Revenue to send an email. And this was at the time of the project. So that has since been changed. And it's just a really basic example of how yes, acknowledge legislation. There's definitely a point for it to be there, like privacy and accessibility, etc. But don't use that as a burden to constrain what your future vision is, because especially around cases of updating legislation to embrace technology, those changes will inevitably come. We found a very similar issue around Queensland State Archives. So record keeping is probably the least sexy government activity, and yet it's probably the most critical to maintaining trust in our broader democracy. And the Public Records Act, which is as of now at this moment going through a review, but when we were doing the project, what we found was the legislation was really inhibiting. It wasn't future focused. It wasn't technology agnostic. It was not taking into consideration the fact that the user may be an algorithm or a bot as opposed to a human. So the user was very different. So we ended up doing a review of the Public Records Act, which we've now, thank goodness, they've actually agreed to doing the review that's happening now. And we made recommendations on really broad scale changes that needed to happen, because in order to truly unlock the value of record keeping and information management moving forward into our future, so we can actually get value from that very unsexy activity that public servants have to do, we would really need to completely rethink what the legislation was framing the activity of record keeping as, but also what constitutes a record. So having the policy and legislation team there is incredibly helpful, but I guess my advice is don't use that as okay, well, that's the end of the road. That's a blockage. We'll never get past that. Another key part, and I think this speaks to perhaps it was William's question earlier around people in the room. And so any project we always worked on, we would have, the commissioner or the minister involved at that high level, like literally coming into the room with the post-its like you're talking about, Tess, with the colour on the whiteboard. They would be getting their sleeves rolled up and getting involved, because without that buy-in, anything you propose is not obviously going to get investment, whether that's political will or actual funding. So we always found that was really important to have them in the room, but perhaps even equally as important was having we found always having a technology vendor, whether it was the department's preferred vendor who they already worked with, or somebody just there to prove the technical feasibility of what you were proposing. Because when you're working with your citizens and the other stakeholders involved in whatever the service delivery is that you're redesigning or digitally transforming, there's a huge gap between, like you mentioned there, Jane, around, World Bank talking to technology companies. There's a digital literacy piece there. So if you can have somebody in there going, yep, what you're describing is machine learning, or what you're describing is, is dedupe for data. And if they can say how that works, then it means when you've got the ministers or the commissioner in the room, they can say, oh, okay, I can understand why you are recommending this. And I guess another barrier or risk that we saw arise was because the nature of our work was to come in and say, here's our vision for 2030 or 2020 or whatever a 10-year horizon was, the tangibility of that can sometimes get lost. So I think, Michael Rosen's still on the call here, but, he really embraced a framework of, well, when you set that future vision of what the new service delivery looks like, you need to set a 20-day, 20-month, and then that 2020, 2030 plan. So what does completely reimagining future record keeping look like? Well, in the 20-day version, it might mean literally picking up a phone and making closer relationships with key stakeholders. So by stepping out into really micro, medium, and more complex tasks, then people's fear of change tends to reduce a little bit more, especially in stuff that, everybody's always change exhausted. So it's or change fatigue, I should say. So it's nice to see, well, how can you bring them on board with sort of those micro tasks to make it seem a little bit easier? And I guess the final barrier that we've come across previously is around context. And again, I think somebody asked this in the chat about connecting with people who maybe are not digitally included or hard to reach. And I've definitely found in the emergency management space, any digital transformation that happens in that is never going to be able to remove the human from that process or have a human process kind of backup involved. You could have all the high tech in the world telling you where the fire's going and how to communicate it to people at scale to get people to move effectively, show them maps, etc., to get them to drive on the right roads. But when power goes out, what are you going to do? Like, your whole digital transformation initiative is now moot. So I just guess that's another key thing to keep in mind, what's relevant to your context and how important is the human touch still in that.
Wow, you've taken us through quite a role there. Where do you think digital transformation processes and the sort of perhaps recognizing that co-design is a sort of a key ingredient will be most impactful in the public sector? And what do you think is the opportunity, picking up some of these new terms, what is the opportunity appetite? We know risk appetite is usually quite high. What's the opportunity appetite?
I definitely found, and I know I will go back to the record keeping example here. When we were working with Queensland State Archives, we developed this idea of a compliant by default bot. So, stop asking public servants to engage in a third activity of public record keeping, where stuff just gets filed and nobody really sees what the day-to-day value or future value is of it, other than a compliance check. So, a cover your butt activity. The bot, the idea is that it would run like an antivirus software and it would just keep going and you wouldn't have to engage in it. It wouldn't be exhausting. And we saw such a huge opportunity appetite across the world, not just in Queensland, for something like this, because it's not a Queensland specific problem. And I guess continuing into that community of archivists, there was really an appetite to say, we are actually a value. We're being defunded around the world. But what we don't realize is if the public sector truly embraced compliant record keeping and we actually had line of sight as public servants to what's there, what's being created, we would have a really good opportunity to use that as business intelligence. So imagine if a minister actually had oversight on how many blockchain projects had been funded across that government, whether it's state government portfolio or federal government level. So then you could start to look at where there are synergies that could be gained from these processes. So if somebody's engaged with the community already about a particular issue, and a project's now funded in another area, how can you connect those insights together to truly realize value? But then also, what does that mean for the future in terms of future resourcing? So I think that's a really specific area, especially because it touches the entire public sector, that if you could unlock those insights so it stops being this like dusty activity where it lives in a cabinet, you could actually see what's going on in the government in real time. That would be really fantastic.
And probably sort of echoes Chaho Chan's point about the sort of reduction in duplication, and therefore the sharing of sort of common information. Hey,
yeah, absolutely.
We've got a lot of questions, and Lynn, thank you very much for bringing us back to the start, because she wants to know what the term co-design, how you are all using that term, and is it just about designing solutions with the customer, or just inviting them in for user testing to validate what's already been crafted? I suspect not. Or looking at sort of creating the way in which identity for homeless persons could be undertaken. And boy, that project, if you like, has been around for a long time. Or even, how to apply this in state or federal government. Might go right back to the start of the group and the panel. And Jonathan, would you care to have a shot at sort of defining co-design and when to apply it?
Sure. I think there's plenty of situations where we can apply co-design, Jane, and unfortunately there's an existing system in front of us today. So sometimes it is very much undertaking a very bespoke co-design activity with the end user to understand a particular pain point to try and make an improvement. It might be trying to reduce customer effort or, reduce staff hours on processing something quite particular. Yeah, it might just be about improving a letter because the fundamental transformation objective hasn't been achieved yet, or the legislative instrument that we heard before from Paula still requires us to send letters. There's plenty of really weird examples that I've worked through myself, and sometimes it's having a couple of different chats at attorney generals to try and get a different answer for you. But sometimes it's just about making incremental improvements. So the co-design activity is quite focused and bespoke. But there's other examples where it should be more holistic, and it is holistic. And, if I can leave this group with some genuine examples where we are trying to do it, to say, government can always do better. We could always work more holistically across agencies and across policy domains. But one that I'm doing right now, and it's something you'll find in the media. I can't talk in detail about the particular measures, if you will, but abolishing the cashless debit card. It's one of those wicked problems. There's some of the sensitivities in particular regions require a different response, yet that it's a national piece of legislation and a policy setting. And it's not just removing a card, because what wraps around this is a whole range of services that both Services Australia, Department of Social Services offer, states and territories, local government and not-for-profit organisations in some of these regions in Cape York, just as one example. There's other regions. So the need to do co-design in such a wicked problem like that is absolutely essential. And this isn't about designing the color of the card or working out whether you can use it and whether tobacco's in or out. They're all the questions, right? There's far more comprehensive challenges we're trying to work through. And we're using a co-design approach to actually help inform government what to do there. In other words, doing that well before what often is described, if you're not in government, as a new policy proposal, and usually attached to a cabinet submission, going through a cabinet room, and then out of that spins some funding and some authority, if you will, so to actually inform what we should do there. But the important thing, and I made this comment earlier, Jane, was something like this isn't a set and forget. We do an element of co-design. We try our darndest best in the timeframes we've got, which are very tight. again, it wouldn't take much to search on Google to find those timeframes. It's not going to be enough. We need to go back to this really quickly, understand the unintended consequences of some of the decisions that we're going to make based on the co-design, and understand, is there any more configuration changes, policy settings, different approaches in different regional settings that we need to apply, and come back to government on that advice. So we're generally using co-design in that process, bringing policy partners to the fore. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable for them, because often, I think, again, it was Paula sort of talking about the regulatory or policy departments sort of setting a policy objective. It's not abstract or different from the application in service delivery. They need to come together, and they need to understand what the genuine effect is to real customers when some of those settings don't work the way they think they do.
Great.
So I can unpack that more, but that's probably one right now. Big impact, really vulnerable customer base, very complex, and a genuine attempt to co-design is the only way we're going to get through this.
We're all punting for you. Any of the other panelists interested in tackling that, or the next question, which we might have, I think one of the panelists actually touched on, which was the fact that if you're senior, you can actually, senior in the organization, you can actually drive some of these co-design processes. But what if you're the person that Michael mentioned that's got this great idea, and the sort of span of influence and control needs to be sort of put into the micro space? Do you think that's as valuable enough to apply co-design in those sort of circumstances, in those sort of the micro ambition space? And perhaps Tess, would you like to tackle that one?
Thank you. I completely understand, but I'd like to say that like, to encourage everyone, it doesn't matter like what level you are. I think if you've got a good idea and want to kick a process off the ground, certainly find somebody that might, like, find a senior level sponsor. And sometimes, you know, I've been in the Department of Health and I didn't have anyone in the Department of Health that would support me, and I was support me undertaking a process, and that was at a more junior level. But I was able to find a mentor in Premier and Cabinet in Central Agency who backed in my ideas, and also was able to help mentor and workshop things with me, and then sponsor me and kick off a process. So I guess my message would be, don't give up. And it comes back to the fundamental around co-design is taking a different approach for government, and it is embracing innovation, and it is about working with the community and talking to multiple people, but it also relies a lot on breaking down government processes and traditional approaches. So I think it's a bit of a rally cry for don't give up, and very much you know, think about the wicked problems and keep the passion around brainstorming and working collectively to problem solve. Because when you do have a win, and like, I've got a few things in my career that one day when I retire, I'm going to look back on, and forever in my life, I'm going to be proud that that I was a part of making that policy idea or that project come to life, because ultimately it makes it's made a difference for people.
It's true. Once you, it's addictive, I think.
Yeah.
Even if the successes are sort of not every time, the fact that this can actually make a huge difference is really sort of addictive. I'm just, I mean, there are so many questions. One, looking at the sort of the question, and perhaps I'll try this on you, Adrian, around, oh, I've lost it. The fact that experience and expertise could be a barrier to innovation, because of that expertise, and perhaps it might even align to the sort of, however senior you are, you've actually gotten to that position of seniority because you've actually been able to benefit from the status quo. So what are your thoughts there in terms of sort of recharging that system and where experience and innovation sort of either clashes or sort of combines?
Yeah, well, that's a good one for the end of the day. No, I think there's a few pieces to that puzzle. You hope that the leadership development programs identify those who are willing to embrace change, and they're the ones who should really be taking on the leadership positions in the organisation. And so you know, but it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes an anti-sponsor is just as powerful as a sponsor, particularly when you've got a highly motivated individual that wants to take on a challenge. So sometimes the obstacles can be a great opportunity for someone to really tackle a project they're passionate about. So that, you know, they can appear to be an obstacle, but what a great success. And I was just thinking, as Tess was talking about reflecting on some of her career challenges, I'm sure one or two in there would have been, I overcome someone who said it couldn't be done, and look what we did, you know, whether as individually or as a group. So, you know, triumph is always you know, comes at a cost, and sometimes it's overcoming a really big barrier. There's, I guess, the other flip side to that. Sometimes you also want to celebrate and recognise projects that weren't a success, and how lucky we were that they weren't. And you know, it's interesting because I've had experience where I've had a leader that was really against one of the projects. We're doing a digital transformation project, and we were the vendor, and we were also working as an advisor to an international government agency that ran a transport network in Europe. And there was this massive resistance to what we were trying to implement as change, and it was, you know, going through a very structured process, all the right stakeholder engagements, all the, you know, textbook sort of engagement across all the different stakeholders. And then when we finally couldn't get there anymore, couldn't get through, and we were sort of running out of time and cost, and it was, you know, causing frustration, we challenged that leader to why, you know, what was the real anchor to the challenge. And they described a situation where that looked similar to them, and if it had have gone through the way that the project team wanted it to, it would have been a disaster for their organisation. And so they'd almost, in the same way as we take pride in success, and sometimes that ties us to our biases as leaders, it can also be because there's some battle scars that have cut deep and are also hard to overcome. So you know, I guess when you bump into those kind of obstacles in projects, sometimes digging a little deeper to understand the underlying motivation behind that, and seeking to be challenged. And if that doesn't work, and kind of a little bit back to, I think William had a question in there as well about, you know, when you run into those obstacles and the challenge just seems too hard, we'll find the person that thinks it's the biggest challenge and ask them to be your anti-sponsor and say, I want to try and solve this, and I feel like you are the person who is going to make this, you know, the problem as clear for me as I can get it. So it's quite amazing what happens when an anti-sponsor backs a project. When they see, yeah, this person's got tenacity, they're going to fix it. It can really build that momentum I was talking about earlier.
That's wonderful advice. Look, I think we have run out of time. There is quite a few questions in there that I think I might try and get the panelists to sort of come together, and we'll respond to the ones around how to actually bring in some of these sort of interests around technology services and connecting to customer mindsets. That mindset over methods is, again, you know, one of the biggies, because as people have said throughout this program, technology will keep on coming. It's actually having the sort of the confidence in the mindset and the relationships to actually drive for those changes that you know are so important. And of course, I always found that if you can actually get the sense of what the citizens are doing and experiencing, that becomes a very strong argument for change rather than retention of the status quo. I'd like to thank our fantastic panelists, Jonathan, Tess, Adrian and Paula. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today and And we look forward to continuing these sorts of conversations and actions. And I'll hand back to Matt. Thank you. Oh, and also to the fantastic questions. You got us going. Bye.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane, for moderating today as well. I'd like to offer my thanks as well to our panelists, Jonathan, Tess, Paula, and Adrian, and to everyone in the group today for that active participation in this. I think we've really fulfilled our aim today to not only provide case studies, ingredients, and success factors, but to debate and discuss those and consider how do we create ambition to change from how do we fix it to how do we get there. So a really, really dynamic session today. So just as we close up and we close up the program, I'm going to ask, as I did at the start, I'm going to ask you to help us, please, with a very quick 5-question survey. It'll only take 2 minutes on this module, and to also talk about what's next. So this is not the end. We will send out a certificate of participation to everybody early next week, and we thank you for that. The other options for you to further engage with us are through the survey, identify some areas of interest, and we'll get back to you with some options for some deep dives. Use the AWS Institute Network LinkedIn page to keep the conversation going, and also pick up some of the video libraries from the digital transformation site on AWS on video library. So that being said, I also wanted to thank on behalf of QUT our colleagues in the digital profession and in AWS for the co-design that we've gone through for this workshop and for future iterations of the workshop. So my thanks to all on the call and to all who have made the call possible. Have a great day.